Hello and welcome to another lecture for AP World History. This lecture is going to focus on the intellectual changes that have been taking place in Europe throughout the Renaissance era into what we like to call the Enlightenment period. We have to go back to the Renaissance to discuss some of those changes. We did not discuss them in the previous time period because really the intellectual changes, the purpose of understanding intellectual changes is so that you can comprehend what is going to happen in the revolutionary movements of the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Haitian Revolution. So when we're talking about the Renaissance, we're really talking about beginning in 1450. This is actually where your AP Euro class will start. So one of the reasons why the Renaissance even happened was because of those this High Middle Ages new trade patterns that is opening up for Italy. The Italian states were bringing in new intellectual forces that the Muslims had preserved throughout the Dark Ages and into the Middle Ages. And a lot of those works were going to be written in the Greek or the Latin. So many people in Italy, a lot of your scholars in Italy, were able to read these old Greco-Roman works. So they were reading things by Euclid and all these other Greco-Roman math science guys and political theorists like Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and all those guys. And what they're going to do is rediscover these thought processes. And a lot of these people obviously were writing in a time period where there was a separation between church and state. You have to go back to that old Greco-Roman philosophy ideas that we talked about in our second unit, where we discussed the law of nature versus using religion as law, where Europe had pretty much become under this control of this papacy, and the Pope was really running the show politically. And so we're going to see changes there throughout this intellectual changes idea as we go through the rest of the course. So one of the ideas that comes out of humanism, which is the study of Greco-Roman classics, is the idea of individualism. The idea that each individual has something to contribute to society. I know this is difficult for you guys to understand because you grow up in a world where you're told that you can be whatever you want to be when you grow up. Well, back in the day, you became what your father was. If he was a blacksmith, you were a blacksmith. If he was a farmer, you were a farmer. There wasn't a lot of intellectual curiosity. There wasn't time to do things like that, and most of the population couldn't read or write anyway. Well, what ends up happening with individualism is the idea of scholarly pursuits being an acceptable career choice. So this is going to pave the way for things like the art that was going on in the Renaissance. It was now okay to be an artist or to write books or to study. And that's something that was totally new for this post-Middle Ages era. And as a result, we get the development of the university system. The university system reestablishes itself during this time period. Previously, the only schooling that anybody really did were monks and a priest, and even that was limited. So all of the schooling was controlled by the Catholic Church. Well, at this point, we end up starting to look at this idea of secularism. Now, today, secular really means, anything that's not religious, but that's not the case here. The idea was that these ideas were going to lead one closer to a Christian God. The idea that discovering how he created the universe would help a person believe in him more, or that scientific study or scientific research would just prove the existence of a God. Secularism means that you're studying works that are outside of what the church is writing, but it doesn't mean that it's anti-Christian or anti-God in this case. That is something that is a modern concept of the term secularism. So this Renaissance idea and this study and this humanism that's happening in the Italian states does start to spread. And we also have this new invention called the printing press. And the printing press makes the spread of these new intellectual ideas and this new emphasis on study spread even further throughout all of Europe. And as a result, we get two other new intellectual ideas that we talk about with the Scientific Revolution and the Reformation. So in the Reformation, there's four main players that you need to know. The causes of the Reformation are really founded in the Renaissance and science. What the Renaissance ideas were doing was encouraging individual study. Well, Martin Luther and John Calvin and Henry VIII spent a lot of time in religious study. And as a result of that, they started to see things that were not necessarily in the Bible, that the Catholic Church was promoting. And so that led them to create this Reformation. So one of the things that Martin Luther was very, very against was the selling of indulgences. The purpose of the indulgence was basically, it was kind of like a get out of purgatory free card. When one dies in the Catholic religion, in order to pay off your sins, you enter into this area called purgatory. You cannot be in the presence of God unless you are free of sin. And so the idea is if you spend some time in purgatory, then you would absolve yourself of your sins, and then ultimately you would reach heaven and be entered into the oneness with God. Well, the idea of the indulgence was that you could purchase less time in purgatory. So the Catholic Church was selling these little pieces of paper all over Europe. And what they were doing with that funding was paying people like Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling. So what the church was trying to do was keep up with this secular idea. One of the things out of the Renaissance that developed was that if you were rich, it was because God loved you more. You were being blessed by him. And so the church obviously had to keep up with that. But in order to maintain that, they had to compete with these great kings and queens of Europe who were building things like Versailles and these massive palaces. And so the only way to do that is with money. And so they came up with this idea of the indulgence. And the other thing that really bothered most of the reformers was the increased power of the papacy. You could not be crowned king in any country unless the Pope put the crown on your head. The church also handpicked the bishops that were in each of the different states. And so we end up with this time period where the kings are challenging the Pope's power. And that wasn't necessarily the goal of John Calvin or Martin Luther, but it definitely was the purpose of Henry VIII's Reformation. So talking about Martin Luther, the story of Martin Luther, he was actually a middle-class man who was going to school to become a lawyer. And he was caught out in a rainstorm one day, and he told God, if I survive this thunderstorm and I don't die from lightning, then I will become a monk. He survived, and so he became a monk. While he was doing his studies, he noticed things like the indulgences weren't in the Bible. And he noticed things about the papal power that wasn't necessarily in the New Testament readings or in the Old Testament text. And so what he did was he wrote this list, the 95 Theses, of things that the church needed to reform. He didn't mean to create a new church. He wrote the 95 Theses in Latin so that only church leaders could read it. He publicly nailed it to the door in Wittenberg, which is in Germany, on October 31st, 1517. When he nailed this thesis to the door, someone got it, translated it into German, and because they're in the land of the printing press, it got readily distributed. And Martin Luther accidentally created a new church. He created this revolutionary religious change that we call the Reformation. Again, his goal was just to get the church to clean up some of the things that weren't quite right, some of the corruption that was going on. And so as a result of that, we end up with a new religious belief called Lutheranism. Some of the theories were things like justification by faith. There's no purgatory in Lutheranism. The idea is that if you believe in a Christian God and you believe that Jesus is the Messiah, then you get into heaven. That there's no weighing of good versus bad. There's no doing time for your sins. The idea that everyone is a sinner and that but the idea that Christ came to pay for those sins is something that Luther found throughout the New Testament. And so he felt that the good works part of the Catholic belief system was not necessarily something that was presented in the New Testament. Obviously, he's going to be anti-indulgence. The church will ultimately stop selling indulgences. They said, our bad, we shouldn't have been doing that. You're right, it wasn't in the text. He also says that bishops should be an authority over different regions rather than this papal power. He really did not like that the Pope had all this political power because, unfortunately, a lot of the popes and the cardinals, their positions were being bought. The Medici family were buying, they had a cardinal who was 9 years old simply because he bought the position. So the idea was that corruption amongst the leadership would go away if the bishops were in leadership over their individual territories. And so what Luther was trying to do was create this separation between government and religion. And that's a very revolutionary idea for this time period. He says that the Bible is the only authority for the way that a person should act. And he felt that the individual should have the ability and the right to read the Bible himself. And so he does translate the Bible into German. He feels like the Bible should be written in the vernacular languages so that the individual could read it. Up to this point, the Bible was only printed in Latin, and the only people that could read it were members of the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. And to be honest, some of the priests couldn't read Latin themselves. They weren't necessarily being educated in a way where they could read Latin. So he felt that the individual should have the ability to read the Bible himself. He did maintain infant baptism. He did maintain that idea of original sin and that the infant baptism is a symbol of the Christian faith. And he also maintained communion. A lot of you guys maybe celebrate the Lord's Supper in your church. Communion with transubstantiation. So there's two beliefs about communion. One is that the wafer and the wine, grape juice, whatever you use, literally transforms into the blood and body of Christ through a miracle. The Catholics maintain transubstantiation. Lutheranism will also maintain transubstantiation. What Martin Luther accidentally does again is creates religious wars. What ends up happening is unfortunately, a lot of the princes of the Holy Roman Empire saw an opportunity to gain political power, and so in order to separate themselves out from the papacy's control, they wanted to practice Lutheranism. So after some wars, the Peace of Augsburg was written in 1555, which recognizes Lutheranism as a legitimate religion within the Holy Roman Empire. At the same time, we have a guy named John Calvin who is creating Calvinism, and he's actually centered more in Sweden-French border. He believed in the literal interpretation of the Bible and felt that his main idea was predestination. The idea of predestination is that God has already ordained who is going to heaven and who is not. And the way that you know if you're a chosen one is by your actions. So the idea is that you still needed to act like a Christian, and if that would show and prove to the world that God picked you. Some of his rules included things like no drinking, no dancing, no gambling. This is really where the Puritans will come to the United States, is to escape persecution about their very strict religious belief system. They didn't wear color. They were very, very strict in their actions, and that is, if you were able to maintain those actions, then you were proving yourself to be predestined as one of God's chosen ones. Church and state were the same thing to John Calvin. There was no separation. The leader of the church should also be the leader of the government, and he actually created his own little town called Geneva, where he was the leader and he was the head of both the church and the state. And if you committed a crime, then you were committing a sin on top of that, and so you had to pay for both the fact that it's a sin and a crime. Now, Henry VIII, who was the King of England, created a whole new problem. He challenged the power of the Pope, and one of the things that he really was challenging was the Pope's ability to have political control within the individual states. He felt that since the old idea of the royals being holy and being chosen by God, that he himself could be the head of his own state's church. So that's where Lutheranism does come into Henry VIII's ideas. The idea that a local ruler, a local leader, is better for the people than a person in Rome who may or may not have purchased his office. Obviously, this is a little bit hypocritical, considering Henry VIII was the King of England. The idea is that Henry VIII really was doing this as a political move, not so much necessarily as a religious belief. However, in his writing, Henry VIII is very adamant about his religious belief and about his devotion to a god. He makes himself the head of the Church of England, and of course one of the first things that he does is he divorces his wife, his very Catholic wife, in order to marry Anne Boleyn. And again, you hopefully you know a little bit about Henry VIII. The whole purpose of Henry VIII's Reformation was really to get a son for the throne, which ultimately he does eventually get. However, that son dies at a very young age. One of the biggest changes, Henry VIII doesn't change much about the belief system at all. Really, the only thing that changes in what Henry VIII was doing was the idea of the papacy and who should be in charge. He kept most of the other traditions and most of the other sacraments of the Catholic Church, including things like transubstantiation and holy orders and all of those kinds of things. One of the biggest things that he does change for England, though, is he dissolves the monasteries. The monasteries in England obviously were very large, and it was a lot of land, and those monastery lands were controlled by the church. So when he got rid of the monasteries, he's basically taking land back from the Catholic Church. And he himself, of course, controlled that land because he's the head of the church and the head of England, and he distributed that land to his favorites. And that's actually where we get things why Downton Abbey, just to use a modern example, it was an abbey, it was a monastery. And so what it ends up happening is these very rich lords and ladies take over this land at the will of Henry VIII. And so he's establishing a lot of political control, because the idea is that you are favored by the king, and then you don't want to make the king mad, so you're going to keep up your loyalty to him so that you can keep your lands in your big, huge house. Elizabeth I changes the British church, the Anglican church, to be a little bit more Calvinist. She very rarely actually, before she was queen, she was very adamant about being Protestant, which makes sense because her Catholic sister Mary was sitting on the throne for a little while. She was very adamant about the piety that was associated with Calvinism while she was rising to power. She didn't wear color. She did everything anti-Catholic. She was just very, very Calvinist in her belief system. When she comes into the monarchy, she changes things a little bit. She likes the fashion. She does drink. She does gamble. She does spend a lot. She does embrace a lot of those things about being a monarch. But she does challenge the church, the Catholic Church, in a couple ways. But first, by removing all the Catholic bishops. She passed the Act of Uniformity, which means that all of the churches in England were supposed to be this Calvinist Anglican belief system. She also helped create the Book of Common Prayer, which set down the belief system of what will become the Anglican Church. And there were laws about tolerance of Catholics and other religions within England as well. What ends up happening post-Elizabeth to England in regards to religion is that her cousin James takes the throne, and there's this issue of how Calvinist and how Catholic each king would be. And so every time we would see a new wave of people come over to the United States, it was because there was a change in leadership in England. So when the Puritans came, it was because Mary was in charge, and so she was being anti-Calvinist. But then Elizabeth I was pro-Calvinism, and so it just kept going back and forth. So to be in England during the Reformation, it was very difficult to know what books were legal, what you were allowed to believe and what you weren't allowed to believe, which religion you were supposed to be. It was very confusing for most of the people of England. All of this will also lead into the scientific revolution, and what we get out of this is scientific theory. The idea that beliefs could be proven through a scientific process. And so that scientific process that you guys do for your science fair projects was created as a result of the scientific revolution. The idea of coming up with a hypothesis and testing that hypothesis and proving it or disproving it, that becomes the norm for all belief systems. So the idea that and again, it wasn't necessarily anti-church or anti-religion. Especially early on, most of your scientists felt like they were proving the existence of God through science. And there's still, debate about the reconciling religion and science into one being, and that whether science proves the existence of a God or not, obviously is still a debate. In schools, teaching evolution versus creationism, all those things are still debatable and still hot topics within the United States. One of the main new theories that comes out as the scientific revolution is the heliocentric theory. The idea up until Copernicus was that everything revolved around the earth, that God's creation, the earth, was the most important thing in his universe, and so it was at the center, and everything else revolved around us. Copernicus writes a book called On the Revolution of Heavenly Spheres, and he publishes it in 1543 that says, no, the sun is the center of the universe, and we are just one of the many planets of the universe that rotates around the sun. This freaks everybody out. Religiously, this is a big challenge to the ideas of Christianity that were in place in Europe at this time. It wasn't mathematically proven until Galileo writes his book in 1632. So it takes almost 100 years for the science and the math to catch up to figure out that, yes, we actually revolve around the sun. Copernicus's theory was correct. Galileo will be excommunicated from the Catholic Church. He comes in and tells the Pope, hey, I was just kidding. But it doesn't really matter, because at this point with the printing press, his book was already out there. Everybody was reading it. So yeah, I take back my my math and my proof, but it meant nothing because his theory was already out there. We also have big changes in medicine and anatomy. William Harvey is going to figure out the whole heart thing. Up to this point, a lot of people felt that the blood flowed from the liver. Obviously completely wrong. One of the biggest changes that resulted from the Renaissance artists spent a lot of time dissecting cadavers. So up until this point, because the idea is that humans needed their body in the Revelation and when Jesus comes back to earth, that you could not do autopsies because you needed the body intact. And so what ends up happening is through the Renaissance, the artists were actually doing a lot of dissection of cadavers, of bodies, so that they could make their art look more real. Well, that will also bleed into science. And so you have these people studying anatomy and figuring out the human body systems, which will obviously improve medicine over time. And we have changes in chemistry. Chemistry is no longer witchcraft. It's no longer magic like the Middle Ages. Chemistry is now a science, and that will also play into creation of medicine. We will have things by the end of the 1800s into 1900s like penicillin, vaccines, and all that kind of stuff as part of this scientific revolution. And then, of course, the concept of gravity. Isaac Newton is going to figure out gravity and put in mathematical numbers, which will create all the stuff you have to learn in physics. Political science changes dramatically as a result of all this new thinking. And we end up with what we call the political spectrum. So you have this line: the idea of any country is to operate as close to center as you possibly can. So liberals on the left usually want change. Conservatives, who are on the right of the political spectrum, usually want things to stay the same. What needs to change and what needs to stay the same changes as time moves on. So in the late 1750s, conservatives wanted to maintain hereditary and absolute monarchies. They wanted to keep their rulers on the throne. They wanted to keep the Tudors there. They wanted to keep the Bourbons on the throne. They didn't necessarily want to change those things. The liberals in the late 1750s started to call for constitutions. England writes the first constitution in the modern age, the Constitution of 1689, and actually does put limits. A constitution puts limits on the executive power, puts limits on the monarchy. It's not a democracy. It just puts limits on what the king can do. And this really is foundation for, the foundation of all this was found in the Magna Carta of 1215. So the idea that a king cannot act alone. Well, different countries were more capable of controlling their liberals or, putting those movements down than others. And we'll look at each one of those countries separately. And really, that's the whole purpose of your course next year in AP European History. So if we go into the early 1800s, the conservatives now want to maintain constitutional monarchies, where the liberals want to expand voting rights and head more for republic or democracy type of systems. So you can see that once the liberals get what they want, they become the conservatives. And this is the case all through, even today. So if you think about your modern conservative, they're usually older, they usually have money, and they're usually already in charge. Your liberals are the people who want, usually are not in charge, may not necessarily have a voice in the government, and may not necessarily be getting what they need. And so that's where you get a base definition of what a conservative and a liberal is. So if we go into the mid-1800s, the conservatives are still working to maintain constitutional monarchies, but we now have this thing called the Industrial Revolution. And so the conservatives need to maintain that control of that labor force. They have to find a way to keep capitalism and to protect those capitalist ideas. They need to find a way to keep those in place because they're the ones with the money, they're the ones who are rich. Obviously, on the other side of the political spectrum, liberals want to continue to expand voting rights, and they want to change working conditions. Again, Great Britain, very progressive in this idea, actually had already put in place the Factory Act of 1833. They were changing child labor laws, they were expanding education programs, and they were creating things like work hours and all that kind of stuff. So the British were actually very, very progressive in regards to these ideas. We go into the late 1800s. The conservatives still want the same thing, but the liberals are adding things like expanding working conditions into things like health insurance, sick days, protection of your job. They also want to expand education, and your liberals also want to start talking about abolition and expanding women's rights. So all those things are slowly changing as we go through the rest of this course. All of this leads to the ideas of the Enlightenment. A lot of those political spectrum things were coming out of writings from the Enlightenment. The idea is applying science to social classes that would cause political changes. That's what the Enlightenment was all about. The Enlightenment basically would have, the enlightened thinkers would have these meetings. They were called salons. They were mainly middle class people who now have leisure time. So a lot of them were women. A lot of the enlightened thinkers were women. They were not necessarily publishing their own books. If they were probably under some type of male pseudonym. And they basically, what they end up doing is creating what's called the encyclopedias. And yes, kind of like Wikipedia. The encyclopedias were publications of scholarly journals, scholarly articles, and what that does is it allows this new literate middle class to expand their ideas in science, math, religion, and politics, and those ideas will spark what we're talking about in our next section of the course, the revolutions. And so keep this movement of intellectual ideas in mind as we go through the revolutions. As you read some of the enlightened thinkers, you're going to be reading some of our revolution documents like the Declaration of Independence, Declaration of Rights of Man. And you can see these liberal political ideas that are coming out as a result of science. So thank you for watching. I hope you learned something and you enjoyed it.